everybody. Welcome to this human rights lecture. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jaap Jansen and I'm program maker at Studium Generale. And the lecture of tonight is organized on the occasion of Human Rights Day, which was actually yesterday, the 10th of December. And on this day we celebrate that the declaration was signed by the United Nations. And this year is special because it's exactly 75 years ago that the world united around this groundbreaking document. Born out of the horrors of the Second World War, the declaration said that human beings were born free and equal, regardless their nationality, their religion, their ethnicity, or anything else. But how is that aim working 75 years on? What is left of what 192 countries laid down, so well intended in this document? Is it still the right document to tackle the problems that we face today? Can it, for example, be applied to climate injustice? And maybe even, is it a Western construct not useful in a world that is so geopolitically challenging as it is today? Only look at what's happening in Gaza. That's what we are going to discuss today, at least that's what I hope. And with us to do so is Professor Antoine Buyse, and I would like to thank you for coming to Maastricht. And he is a professor of human rights from a multidisciplinary perspective at Utrecht University. He is also director of the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights. And he is connected to a lot of other institutes and organizations. I will name a few. For example, the Center for Global Challenges, the Expert Council on NGO Law, and the Human Rights Commission of the Dutch Council of International Affairs, to name but a few. So I would like to give the floor to Antoine Buyse. The lecture will take 1 hour, and we have half an hour of for Q&A, for questions and answers, I hope. So please, so please give him a warm applause. The floor is yours, Antoine.
Good evening, everyone. I indeed hope to give you some answers. I won't talk for an hour, but shorter, so we'll get to the questions sooner, hopefully. It's a pleasure to be here from the other human rights city in the Netherlands, Utrecht. Here on the Middenbroedersberg tonight, indeed, exactly 75 years and 1 day since the Universal Declaration was adopted. And yesterday, across the world, whether it was in Paris, where it was officially adopted 75 years ago, or in many other places, in spite of the miseries of the wars and inequalities and devastating climate change, there were a lots of small and big commemorations, celebrations of 75 years of this Universal Declaration. And the question, of course, is what's the value of such a by now quite elderly document 3 generations ago in the face of all those challenges? Is it something that is rock solid, hard as steel, or is it something which is more like chewing gum, which you can stretch all directions and which doesn't really protect much? So that is the bigger question I would like to go through today with you. And I want to take you on a journey through time to explore how we can perceive human rights, so what they are, how universal they are, whether they are universal, and how relevant they are today in our society and in other societies. And I will do so by introducing you to a number of people along the road of the lecture, because I think stories about rights are nothing without the people behind them. So you'll meet a number of interesting people, hopefully. So let's start with that journey. And our first stop is in Italy, on an airbase, somewhere in southern Italy, towards the end of World War II. Sitting on a steel truck, you see one of the small boys holding a very large package compared to his own body size, and it's a package of chewing gum, which he's holding as a prized possession, and it was given to him by one of the Allied soldiers standing next to him. Kind of a cheerful scene in the midst of a war that was fully raging, of course. And for many European children at that time, in the months that followed as well, receiving chewing gum or chocolate was really a sign of the end of the war, of a sign of liberty, a sign of another world that they had not experienced ever, maybe, in their young lives. And at the same time, he's sitting on a truck, and the truck is partly made of steel. And both the steel factories and the factories where the chewing gum was made changed during the wartime, because so many men were mobilized. A lot more women started to work in these factories, and that emancipated, at least in a number of countries, the women workforce, and therefore worked towards equality because of the crisis of the war. And if we go even one step further, a lot of the ingredients for those steel trucks and for the chewing gum that the boy is holding came from countries, mines and plantations in places that were still under colonial rule, where people were not free at all and where working conditions were usually even worse than in the factories where long hours were made in the West. So there's a lot in just one picture that also relates to the metaphor I want to use for tonight as human rights. Are they solid as steel or are flexible as chewing gum? So to start off with, what exactly are human rights? And I'm going to be a bit more flexible myself as well and to walk forward, because not to be too far. One of the most interesting answers I ever got on what human rights are was a few years ago when I was sitting in a train, just like the one I took now today to come here, and opposite me in a four-seater were two elderly people, an elderly couple. I was reading my book for work, and they looked kind of in a bad mood. And after 10 minutes or so, they asked me, "So, what are you reading?" So I showed them and said, "I'm reading a book about human rights," and their faces turned even more sour because they said, "We have to take the train today because we wanted to go to The Hague by car, but there's no space for our car. Our right to park our car is not even respected here, so we have to take this damn train." So for them, a human right to park their car. Now, try then to explain in this four-seater to these people that that might not be a human right, although it was quite crucial at the core of their day at that moment. So what exactly are human rights then, if we try to think of it? Maybe this picture gives a better idea. This is a mural painting that was made this year in my city, in Utrecht, showing the first article of the Dutch Constitution, which says that everyone who finds themselves in the Netherlands will be treated equally in equal situations, and no discrimination on the basis of any ground, whether it's national, like religion, political views, or anything else, any other ground is allowed. It's a mural which shows one of the very basics of human rights. This constitution in the Netherlands exists for 175 years, so a century more than the Universal Declaration. But this particular edition, which is Article 1, maybe the most famous part, is quite a recent edition, actually, from just a generation ago. And even more recent, last year, namely, two additions were made, namely the on any other ground was specified a bit more, so to the grounds of political convictions and religion and other grounds were added any disability or any sexual orientation. So that shows that human rights is flexible because, like chewing gum, it stretches a bit more and includes more and more different groups. But the underlying principle, which is also in this text in Dutch that you see on the wall, is the principle of not to be discriminated against, and that still stands rock solid, no matter how we explain it more specifically. So maybe a good example to think of what human rights are as basic rights that we need to live in dignity and freedom and under equal terms as every human being. So that makes it slightly more specific, and I said I would introduce you to a few people, so let me start with these three, which I all met in person yesterday. We have started a project in which we connect to every of the 30 rights in the Universal Declaration a particular person in Utrecht from any walk of life that in their lives has something to do with a particular human right. So on the left you see Rolien. She is an author, and she has written a lot about her ancestors and how they were enslaved in Suriname and in the Caribbean. She stands for Article 1. Every human being is born equal in dignity and rights. In the middle you see Jamil. Jamil is, for those of you who watch sports, he was the world champion in Taekwondo. But in his daily life, he helps people in the less affluent neighborhoods of Utrecht. He trains youth and he tries to make clear the importance of education, so the right to education. And on the right, you see little Lea. She's 9 years old, and she stands for the right to holidays and free time, in which, as she said to me and to other people, her parents finally spend a bit more time with her and her brothers. I also talked to her parents, by the way. We were slightly annoyed by that answer. But these are just three examples of very concrete ways in which some of the human rights in the Universal Declaration affect people's lives and can play a role. So that's very practical daily life. But if we take a step back and move into what academic thinking would say about human rights, there's basically four different ways in which you could think about what human rights are, far beyond what lawyers would say it is. The first is on the upper left corner, the two hands, rights as something that are given to you because you are a human being. So this is based on what lawyers would call natural law, but you could, in more everyday language, say rights are given to you according to your philosophy or religion because you are a human. So that could be in Christianity or in Islam, but also in humanistic traditions. So a philosophical foundation. No matter what people say or do, these rights exist beyond people and are given to all people. So it's very much about people, about your conviction. This is not something that can be taken away from you by anyone, no government, no one else. That's one view of human rights. The second one, on the upper right corner, is rights are something that we agree upon, things that are negotiated, things that politicians vote for and put in a constitution, or at the international level, things that diplomats negotiate about. And we have one former diplomat in the room here who has negotiated human rights treaties as well. Things that countries agree on, and something becomes a human right when countries say this is a human right, or when within a country a parliament says this is a human right. Now, in that view, human rights are certainly not always the same and eternal as in the first they are given to everyone. They differ. They differ per country, they differ over time, they may expand, they may shrink. They are very much a product of what human beings do and put into rules. A third view is human rights as something that is fought for on the lower left corner rights don't exist because suddenly these politicians thought, oh, let's have a treaty on the rights of women, or let's have a treaty on the rights of migrants, because suddenly they had an idea in their mind, oh, this is important now. No, this came about because of social struggle. So this is very much a sociological view or an anthropological view of what human rights are. Things are pushed on the table of the powerful people because social movements make that happen. And this has happened a lot. You can think of the famous examples in, for example, Dutch history. Women's voting rights came about because women organized themselves and started to push for voting rights, for equal voting rights. The same for other inclusions of different groups and minorities. So that's the third view. And that again also shows human rights are not taken for granted. They can change. They are not just given. They are fought for because people care about them. Again, slightly different view, as you can see. And the fourth way is rights are just a way to talk about reality. Rights are discourse. So if you walk tomorrow past your local supermarket and you see a homeless person selling the homeless newspaper, for example, you could think of that homeless situation as fact of life, or I find that unjust, or oh, poor man. But you could also say that's a human rights violation. The state, the city, the community should make sure that everyone has basic shelter. So why should anyone be homeless? This is a human rights issue. So human rights as a way to look at social reality. This is something which linguists might say is important. Language matters, the way we talk about things. So 4 quite different ways, which were identified by a legal anthropologist, Marie-Bénédicte Dambour, from neighboring Belgium. 4 very different ways to think about human rights. And depending on who you would ask, some of these matter more than others. So that as a kind of grounder for what we will see tonight. Because you can also think about human rights and just ask people, what do you think are important rights? And indeed, the National Human Rights Institution in the Netherlands last year did exactly that. The College voor de Rechten van de Mens did a large survey and they asked, so what are your main human rights concerns? And they asked a whole trans segment of the Dutch population. And something quite interesting happened. They asked, what are for you the important human rights for society as a whole, so for other people? And there what came out on top was the right to housing and the right to a minimum level of existence. For the Dutch people, bestaansminimum, which has been also a buzzword used a lot in the recent election campaigns. So for other people, housing, minimum level of existence. And then another question they asked was, so what is your own main concern in terms of human rights? And there people answered different things. They said the right to have a clean local living environment, so not polluted, not too much noise, etc. So for people who live next to Schiphol or Tata Steel factories, etc. And living in peace and freedom. So that's an interesting outcome. People did have an idea about human rights because indeed all these things are human rights, but they had a different view on what mattered most to them and what they thought would matter most to other people. So that's what that survey showed. And it also showed that people cared a lot about things which are not the classic civil and political rights, like freedom to say what you want, but a lot about people's socio-economic living conditions. So the housing and the minimum level of existence, etc. And those things often come together actually in practice. So here you see a photo of a protest from last year in the Netherlands where people were using their freedom of assembly, the freedom to protest, to argue for something else, and that is for affordable housing for everyone, which until recently was almost never framed in the Netherlands as a human rights issue, just as a social policy issue. But now it's starting to become also framed, talked about, discourse, as a way of calling it a human rights problem, that you cannot easily afford to have a house. So here people use their freedom to protest to argue for right to housing, which also shows that all human rights are linked to each other, that they are indivisible. Now I want to take you back to that moment in 1948, a few minutes before midnight, when the United Nations agreed on and adopted the Universal Declaration. And I hope this works now, but we have a small fragment from that time. And let's see. Very formal language, very clearly articulated by a lady called Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She was the leading figure in the negotiations that led to a very small text, which you can just carry with you, and containing just 30 human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that night, 1948, 10th of December, in a Parisian palace was adopted. Now this is a strange kind of document, not only quite small, but also probably the most translated document in the world. It exists in almost 500 different languages, which is more than the Bible or the Quran or the IKEA guide or whatever you could think of. So it's been an extremely demanded text, even though it's so tiny and small, just 6-7 pages if you just read through it. And it's also very general. It just expounds and enunciates a number of human rights, just 30 different ones, and that's it. So what happened in those days? What is quite remarkable is that it was negotiated by just a small number of countries. We're speaking just after the Second World War. Not many countries were independent yet, and around 50 countries were negotiating this particular text. These were the people that negotiated this. Is there anything that strikes you about this picture? Yeah, men, white men mostly, older, yeah. Do you see any women at all? One, yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt there, towards the back, she was chairing it. So this was certainly not a representation of the entire world at the table. 1948, there were wars of independence ongoing in several parts of the world, oppressed people fighting against colonialism. This was the year also that Mahatma Gandhi had been assassinated earlier that year. It was the year that no Nobel Peace Prize was awarded out of respect for him, because they wanted to honor him by doing that. It was the year that the State of Israel was founded, so also wars in the Middle East, just like now. Lots of turmoil, and still a lot of Southeast Asia and Europe as well were slowly rebuilding themselves after the war, but very fragile situation still. And not many people at this table. So these 50 countries, mostly Latin American, North American and European countries. And as you could see, indeed, almost no women. But it's a bit like the Asterix story, almost no women. No, certainly there were a few, and they were quite influential and crucial, actually, in these negotiations coming and leading to the Universal Declaration. And also, before I will show you one of them, to make you aware that even though this group was small, it was still not only Western. So at the table there was a philosopher from China, a diplomat from Lebanon, lots of Latin American representatives, a French Jewish resistance fighter, an Australian military colonel, all kinds of people that had been sent there by their countries to negotiate this. And they could come to an agreement on just these 30 rights. But they could only come to that agreement on one condition, that no one, and this is a famous thing that happened when they came out of the negotiation room, they told a journalist, we agreed on the condition that no one asked us why. So we can agree on these 30 rights, but not why they are important or why they exist, because the reasons why we value them are completely different from country to country. So it was some kind of consensus about the what, but not about the why. Now, I told you there were not many women at the table, but a few really crucial ones, and I want to introduce you to another person, and that is Hansa Mehta, one of the representatives from India, had just become independent the year before. She had married to someone from a lower caste, which led to great uproar in her family. So she knew what social prejudice could do to your personal life. And she was one of the toughest negotiators, and she changed something very crucial, because the original text of the Universal Declaration had the wording, every man is born equal in dignity and rights. And she said, no, wait a minute. If we say man, that excludes half of the world's population, we should change this into every human being. And then a lot of the other countries said, oh, do we really need this? And even the chair, who was a woman herself, Eleanor Roosevelt, said, don't worry, man in most languages means humans, so we can leave it as it is. And Hansa Mehta said, no, if we go home in a few months from now and we just agree on the word man, I assure you that then the men in almost every country will say, you see, it's about men, it's not so much about women's rights and equal rights, so we have to change this. And she managed to convince the others. So now the text says every human being throughout the declaration. Quite a crucial change. This is about language, but it also says a lot about content, obviously, because it makes equal treatment much more logical if you have that language. So just a change of a word, but a very crucial one. And there were more like that. The representative of Pakistan, also a woman, of course, the arch enemy of India, she made sure that in the right to marry, there was also the right not to be forced to be married off, so by your parents or by others. And also, almost ironic in current day politics, the representative of Belarus, so this tiny country that is now under quite authoritarian rule, then still part of the Soviet Union, but at the UN a separate state that could negotiate. The female representative of Belarus made sure that equal pay between men and women was included in the Universal Declaration, which now seems quite logical, although research shows also the last few weeks in the Netherlands we're far from there yet in that sense, but she already put that in and convinced the others. So we can see here that even though it was completely non-representative who was negotiating here in terms of countries, in terms of who was at the table, there were very vocal minorities that could convince the others to make some very important changes and to even include rights that otherwise would never have been in there. And this led, after 2 years of negotiations, so on this 10th of December, to this Universal Declaration. No country voted against. just a few countries on that December night 75 years ago abstained from voting. And these were basically the Soviet countries and Eastern Europe that was already under the grip of Stalin, who just didn't vote against but abstained. In their rhetorics, they said, this declaration is too much Western, it has too much civil political rights, we should really be about non-discrimination, etc. So we can't vote in favor of this, although they had been at the table for 2 years. And they had used every negotiation day to slap especially the US in the face with, you shouldn't discriminate. And this was the time of segregation in the south of the US, obviously, still. So there was a very easy point to chastise the major Western power. But in the end, they didn't vote in favor. There were 2 other countries that also abstained, Saudi Arabia, because the declaration also includes a right not just of freedom of religion, but also to change your religion. And there were also a few other elements that they found contrary to Sharia. And the final country that abstained was South Africa, which in that very year officially started its policy of apartheid, which is not entirely in line with human rights, obviously. So that means all the others voted in favor, and ever since, basically every country on earth has, in some form or shape, said yes to the Universal Declaration and subscribe to it. Maybe not in their actions, but in their words they have. So there is no country that structurally says the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in general, nonsense. Eleanor Roosevelt was lauded for her work, and you see her here walking earlier in that same year, 1948. I don't know if you can see this, but this is in the Netherlands. This is actually in my city, Utrecht. On the day that she was given an honorary doctorate by the university. Now, you would think there are enough reasons for her to get one. She was an amazing first lady who really took an active stance in lots of the political work of her husband in the 11, 12 years that he was president. But also obviously was in the midst of negotiating and leading the negotiations to the Universal Declaration. But what did my University of Utrecht give her this honorary doctorate for? And I'll read out what the rector said when he handed this really high accolade to her. You are a perfect mother of 5 children and an inviolable grandmother of 17 grandchildren. You received this honorary doctorate primarily because you are a woman. Now, not the grandest, brightest moment of my university, I must say. So an honorary doctorate for someone who truly deserves it, but for all the wrong reasons. Maybe Eleanor's reaction would probably be, she was very polite, so she grandly accepted it and said, thank you, you're probably honoring my husband. He did so much for Europe during the war, etc. I understand. But later she said something about women, and this was an ironic remark because she was known as the woman who poured tea for all the negotiators at the Universal Declaration negotiations. She said, women are like tea bags. It's only in hot water that you know how strong they are. She didn't say that during the ceremony, though. So there we have it, this Universal Declaration. An interesting story of how it came together in a very special moment in time, but it's important to note it is a declaration. And for lawyers, this means very little. For this may be a fantastic historical moment, a very important symbolical text, an important political moment for the United Nations, but it is not a binding law, it's not a treaty. So immediately after this, countries start to think, some countries at least, what more can we do? And it's maybe not surprising it's not a treaty, because if the aim would have been a treaty right away, probably the countries wouldn't have agreed on it. So a declaration was the most they could get. 1948, start of the Cold War, very difficult moment. So what happened since? We do have now lots of treaties on human rights existing at the international level. You see here the big room in Geneva where the Human Rights Council of the United Nations is housed under a grand ceiling with a dripping oil painting artwork. In the first few months, sometimes a delegate suddenly had a blue dot on their head.
But here is where countries have negotiated in the last years new human rights treaties. And they always based themselves on the Universal Declaration. And the idea was really, okay, now let's put our money where our mouth is and turn this declaration into something more strong, not just something on paper, but something more solid. And that's exactly what they did. So we now have probably 11 or 12 different global human rights treaties, lots of treaties also more in different parts of the world, and over, it's sometimes estimated or counted, more than 200 different human rights. And also, some continents have gone beyond. So in Africa, in Latin America, and in Europe, there's now regional human rights courts where all of us, if we feel our human rights have been violated, can go and complain against a country that we think is responsible for this, such as the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, for example. So we do have now much more than just a small symbolic text. You can actually go somewhere. So that is law and human rights as agreed upon. Think of that upper right quadrant of the four that I showed you. This is on the basis of what countries negotiated. But that's not everything. And I'll show you, and here I'm going to introduce you to three more people actually, an example of where human rights also come from social struggle. It's a very old picture from the 1960s in the Netherlands. This is an old newspaper picture, hence the bad quality. Can I introduce you to Lena Smits, who is standing, Greetje Pruim and Willy Borg. And they are three of the so-called cigar girls, as they were derogatively called. They worked in a small cigar factory in the north of the country, in Nieuwe Pekela. And one day they found out, they knew they were earning less than the men in the factory, but one day they found out that the director of the factory had given a 10 guilders raise to all the male employees. Now, something like that in a small factory, in a small village, doesn't stay a secret long, of course. So the women working in the factory found out, and they found this outrageous. Like, we're already earning less, and now you're giving a pay raise only to the male employees. So they organized themselves, and this was the first, what they called wild strike of women in the Netherlands. They stopped working, and it was, you could say, a very wrong bet of the factory director, because the majority of his employees were women. So when they stopped working, the factory stopped working. No more new cigars for people in the Netherlands. And they stuck to their point for, I think, 1 or 2 weeks, and then the director had to give in. So the pay became more equalized. Now that's a good example of non-discrimination as being fought for in concrete action by these three women and many other of their colleagues. So human rights as a concrete struggle, even in a country like the Netherlands. And this shows something interesting, because once you start thinking of you take some of these general principles, non-discrimination, they kind of get a dynamic of their own, because people say, hey, if you say as a state you take that seriously, then we're going to hold you to it. So now we also want to be treated equally. And therefore, we now have a convention against discrimination of women, we have a convention against racial discrimination, we have a convention for the rights of people with disabilities, for example, and no doubt we still have other blind spots in how we organize our societies that are in the future will be turned into some kind of human rights. More people fighting for their place at the table, basically. So that's an interesting dynamic of human rights, that there is this inclusionary. It's almost like a rock you throw in the water, in the pond, and the rippling effect goes on, even if the states originally never thought of it. Another big discussion in human rights is obviously, are they really universal? You see here a rather traditional mosaic. It dates from the 1980s. It's in the United Nations headquarters in New York. and it depicts the golden rule: do not do to others what you do not want others to do to you. As you can see, it shows all kinds of people around the globe. It was officially unveiled by Nancy Reagan, so it tells you a bit about the context of that. And the big discussion is always, are these human rights really global? Are they really universal? When the states agreed on this Universal Declaration, initially they just called it International Declaration. And just 2 weeks or so before the 10th of December in 1948, the French delegate René Cassin said, why don't we call it universal? Because international, we have so many international agreements, that's between states, but this is for people. And to emphasize that point, we should call it differently. Let's call it universal. And well, he took the floor with that, and they agreed on that. So is it really universal? Whenever you hear critique about human rights or something Western, always think, who is saying it? Because it's not just some academics saying it, it's also politicians. And it's usually politicians that maybe have a lot of power themselves. So if the president of Malaysia, or the prime minister of Malaysia, I should say, because it's a kingdom, or the president of Cuba says human rights are not for us, they're something from Europe or US, think about who says it. Because if you ask any human rights defender in any country, they would never say it's just Western. I'm showing you here 3 human rights defenders from across the globe that, for those of you who have really good sense of geography in the Netherlands, they stand in front of the Ridderzaal here in The Hague, and they're part of the Shelter City project, which houses and hosts embattled human rights defenders. Cities like Maastricht are doing this also today, to get them out of danger for a few months, make them get to some rest and security before they go back to their quite dangerous work. Now, if you ask any of these, are human rights just Western? None of them would say that, because they need just as much as Jamil or Leah here in the Netherlands. And I'm going to illustrate it even further with this picture. And this was taken in Johannesburg in 1956. It's a picture taken by Peter Magubane, and it's entitled Nanny and Child. And you see here something very clear. The white girl is sitting on the front of the bench, which says Europeans only, and Europeans was the euphemism for white people in South Africa. And her African nanny, her black nanny, is not allowed to sit on that bench with her, although her parents have entrusted her with taking care of her for the whole day. She had to sit on another part of the bench where she was allowed to sit. A lot again in one picture. Quite a telling story. Why am I showing this? Because the very first global human rights treaty that was agreed upon after the Universal Declaration was the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Why did that come into being? Because initially, a small group of 8 or 9 African countries, who had just recently become independent, fought for having a human rights convention, a treaty that showed to be against apartheid, against racism, against racial discrimination. So actually our very first human rights treaty on a global level, in the modern sense of the word, has come about because of non-Western states, of African states, pushing for it. So just one tiny example. And then that's one element of the universality discussion. Another element of the universality discussion is you call human rights universal, but actually can everyone really use them or not? Are they really universally applicable? Well, we certainly all can think of hundreds of situations which we see in the news where human rights cannot easily be used. People who are outside their own country, who are forcibly migrating, who are in places where the state doesn't protect them but attacks them. And certainly so in practice, human rights unfortunately are not yet universal, but that doesn't mean that on the principle of them is not universal. And there is a lot of difficulties there, obviously, because if we see human rights as something protecting your basic human dignity, liberty, equality, then you want that protection against anyone, right? Not just a state where you live, but any powerful actor. And it could be a company. There's a famous case of the Ogoni in Nigeria where a Shell oil project leaked oil into the environment, also contaminated a lot of the local living areas of people. And when people started to protest against that, the military regime in Nigeria also convicted several of the protesters and eventually even shot several of them, convicted them to death. Now, this was not just a human rights problem caused by a state, although officially, of course, the death penalty was enacted by the state, but also with some complicity of a private actor, a company. And human rights doesn't yet have a full answer to that, because human rights treaties are made by states and usually bind states. But there is also there a change towards more universalism. Again, this inclusive dynamic. Think about the fact that today countries are negotiating a treaty on human rights and businesses. So also businesses should respect human rights, not just as a nice declaration on their website, but as a real binding treaty. Who is in the forefront of that? Several countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia, not Western countries. So again, the universality is maybe a bit more complex than it seems at first sight. So if we zoom in more closely to today and we look at what is the situation for human rights, it's maybe in some ways a bleak picture because, well, as I said, we read every day about human rights violations and it's also been measured. Human rights are under pressure in a lot of places. And this quite exemplifies it. This is a literal micro-protest in Russia where any normal protesting is not possible anymore. If you would go with a banner in the street, you would be arrested right away. Even people with empty blank banners have been arrested. So the newest way of literally small type resistance is placing little puppets in public space by people anonymously. This one, it's very small, but in Cyrillic it says Mir, peace. So it's an anti-war protest, and these are spread then as pictures on social media. Now, this is a clear example where human rights are under very severe pressure. Does that mean that human rights as a whole are receding? No, certainly not. And I'll show you two examples of that to end with. One is in our own society, not that far from Maastricht, in Eindhoven airport a few years ago. People with a different color of skin were taken out of the waiting lines at the customs when they landed with their planes by the military police of Eindhoven Airport, and one of them had the audacity of mind to ask, "Why are you taking me out of this waiting line? Why is that?" And the military police officer said, "Well, it's amongst others because of the color of your skin." Ha! You could say very stupid military police officer. You could also say he had bad luck, but good for the person who was taken out. He had a legal education. He turned this into a court case and mobilized others. And that's the guy you see in the middle, Pansu Bamenga, who is, by the way, just now elected to the parliament, who said, this is discrimination. If color of skin is part of your selection criteria of why you think someone looks suspect in a waiting line at customs, then it is discrimination. So here, he takes the human right to non-discrimination and uses it hard as steel to go to courts, and with a lot of other NGOs together who helped him with that, won his case. What's the interesting thing here? Even before they won, the military police already changed their policy. Why? Because the bad publicity was so severe that they felt compelled to already do something, even if they had not yet lost a court case. What does it show? That you can use human rights not just in courts, but also to change public opinion. Because it's a way of, think about discourse, of framing a situation as unjust. Another one where human rights are stretched, a bit like the bubblegum, to go further than what they were originally thought of, is the climate change cases in court. In the Netherlands, we've had a famous Urgenda case where the state was told you're not doing enough. And one of the reasons why the judges in the Netherlands said that was based on the right to life, that you're endangering the life of people here by not taking enough action. And the same is now done by a group of children from Portugal who are suffering from every year's increasing wildfires, which affect their state of health because it's dangerous for your breathing and lungs, obviously. And they've taken a lot of governments, including the Portuguese one, but also the Dutch one, to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, this is about climate change, this is about health, but they use human rights to make their claim, and not just to gather a lot of signatures and to lobby their parliament or their local newspaper. No, they take it to court. So they use the hard steel of the law to make a case, but they do so by using the flexibility of human rights. Because when these treaties were negotiated, like the European Convention of Human Rights, where they take their case now in the European Court, it says nothing about the environment, it says nothing about climate change, but judges can interpret a term in an old treaty, in an old declaration, in a new way. They can stretch the concept. And that's what may or may not happen in this case. This is still pending, so we'll see what happens. So I want to end with going back to where we came from at the start. Different soldier, different boy. And why am I showing this one? This is an American soldier, and this is a Russian boy. So this was at the place at the end of the Second World War where the Soviet and American armies met. Apparently some of the Soviet soldiers had some of their children with them. Don't ask me why. This child is also getting something from the American soldier. End of the war seems again a friendly scene where the chewing gum is handed out. It also is very telling in today's world that sometimes the tensions may be enormous between states, but ideas like human rights can still be used to forge a connection. So maybe on the one hand, some of those basic principles from human rights, from the Universal Declaration, they are old, but they have this logic of inclusion in them, so that makes them hard as steel, although it's just a declaration. But they also have this chewing gum character in them, which can stretch their meaning to tackle new issues, whether it's political tensions or climate change or anything else. So I'm going to end with that optimistic note on this very pessimistic world in the last few months especially, and thank you very much. So next time you put your foot on this curb in a chewing gum, you get stuck and you're annoyed, think of that. Thank you very much.